Your goats are trespassing on HOA property. Move them or I'll have them removed!
That's what the HOA president shouted, while she yanked the gate off my cattle fence with both hands and shoved my goats back like livestock didn't belong on their own pasture. I stood 20 feet away watching this woman. Linen blazer, gold sandals, clipboard under her arm. Tear apart a fence my grandfather built in 1962 so she could protect a swimming pool she'd built on my land without a permit, without a survey, and without bothering to check whose name was on the deed. She spent $850,000 on Italian tile and underwater lighting, while my goats drank from a creek her pool was poisoning with chlorine. She didn't know I'd spent 20 years as the county agricultural inspector. She didn't know I'd already filed a quiet title action. And she definitely didn't know what 50 thirsty boar goats do when someone opens a gate downhill from a swimming pool. Tell me, would you have stopped her or let her keep digging? The Callaway place sits on 180 acres of rolling pasture in Payne County, Oklahoma, about 12 miles south of Stillwater. My grandfather bought the original quarter section in 1958 with cash he'd saved from 20 years of roughnecking in the Cushing oil fields. He ran Herefords on it until his knees gave out. My father switched to hay and kept the place going through 2 droughts and a divorce. I came home after college, married a nurse from Perkins named Jolene, and together we turned the operation into something neither of them ever imagined. Jolene loved goats, not in a casual way. She studied breeds, read veterinary journals at the kitchen table, and drove 400 miles to a livestock auction in Abilene to buy our first 6 boar does. Within 3 years she'd built the herd to 50 head, and launched a small business selling handmade goat milk soap and aged chèvre at farmers markets from Tulsa to Norman. The labels had a little drawing of a goat standing on a fence post. She designed it herself. She died 3 years ago. Ovarian cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to funeral. I held her hand in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and floor wax, while machines beeped a rhythm that got slower and slower until it stopped. After that, I kept the goats. Every single one. The soap business, the cheese, the morning feeding routine where 50 animals crowd the gate and holler at you like you're late to their birthday party. I kept it all because it was hers, and keeping it running was the only way I knew how to keep her close. My name is Wade Callaway. I'm 54. I spent 20 years as the Payne County agricultural inspector before I retired early to take care of Jolene. I know every zoning code, every land use statute, and every building permit regulation in this county because I wrote half of them and enforced the other half. The trouble started 3 years before Jolene got sick, when a developer named Brent Trent bought 80 acres of old cotton ground on the west side of my property and broke ground on Timber Ridge Estates, 42 houses, stucco and stone, 3-car garages, price tags between $450,000 and $800,000, iron gate at the entrance with a sign that said, Timber Ridge, a premier living community, in letters tall enough to read from the highway. I didn't mind the subdivision. People need places to live. What I minded was Brent's wife. Shelby Trent, 48. Blonde hair that never moved. A pearl-white Cadillac Escalade she parked like it needed 2 spaces. She wore linen blazers over yoga pants and carried a clipboard everywhere like a general inspecting troops. She'd been HOA president since the first model home sold, and in 7 years, she'd turned a neighborhood association into a personal empire. The first time I met her, she drove that Escalade right up to my cattle gate, stepped out in spotless white sneakers, and wrinkled her nose at the smell of alfalfa hay drying in the barn. Mr. Callaway, your goats are a problem. The smell carries into our community. This is a luxury neighborhood now. I leaned on the gate post and looked at her. Ma'am, my family's been here since Eisenhower. The goats were here before your foundation was poured. She smiled the way people smile when they've already decided you don't matter. Things change, Mr. Callaway. Smart people change with them. Then she got back in her Escalade and drove away, leaving tire tracks in the gravel, and a cloud of her perfume mixing with the honest smell of livestock and Oklahoma dust. I should have paid more attention to that smile, because while I was in Oklahoma City at the annual Cattlemen's Association convention, Shelby Trent built a swimming pool on my pasture. I got home on a Thursday afternoon in late September, The drive from Oklahoma City takes about an hour and a half if you don't hit construction on I-35, and I made it in under 90 minutes because I was thinking about feeding the goats and checking the water troughs before dark. I turned off the county road onto my gravel drive, and that's when I saw it. Heavy equipment tracks cutting through my west pasture. A chain-link construction fence around 2 acres of grass that had been torn up and graded flat. Concrete forms, rebar grids, a portable mixer still running, the drum turning slow with a grinding sound that carried across the field like a mechanical heartbeat. And in the middle of all of it, the unmistakable shape of a swimming pool excavation. 40 feet long, 20 feet wide, 8 feet deep at one end. My goats were crowded into the northeast corner of the pasture, behind a temporary wire fence someone had strung between my posts. 50 animals in a space meant for 10. They were stressed. I could hear them bleating from the truck, that sharp, anxious sound they make when something's wrong and they can't get away from it. I parked, walked to the construction fence, and found Shelby Trent standing next to a man in a hard hat with a clipboard and a Timber Ridge Estates polo shirt. She was pointing at the excavation and talking about tile options. Shelby. She turned around like I'd interrupted a board meeting. "Oh, Wade, you're back. Good. The board voted to install a country club pool for the community. We're ahead of schedule. On my pasture." She tilted her head the way you'd tilt it at a child who doesn't understand directions. "This parcel is designated common area on the subdivision plat. Your goats were trespassing on HOA property. We relocated them." I looked at the man in the hard hat. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I looked at the excavation. I looked at my goats jammed into a corner, hay scattered on bare dirt, water trough bone dry. "Show me the plat," I said. Shelby pulled a folded paper from her clipboard and handed it over with the confidence of someone who's never been told no. I unfolded it. The plat showed the Timber Ridge boundary extending 200 feet east of where I knew, where I had always known, my property line sat. According to this document, the pool site was inside the subdivision. According to my family's deed, it was 200 feet inside my cattle field. I folded the paper and handed it back. "I'll need a copy of that." "Of course," she smiled. "And Wade, the board would appreciate it if you'd keep your animals on your side of the boundary going forward. The smell is a concern." I didn't answer. I walked back to my truck, drove to the house, and went straight to the fireproof cabinet in my office, where I keep every land document my family has ever filed. I pulled the deed. I pulled the survey from 2004. I pulled the county assessor's parcel map. Every single one showed the same boundary line, and every single one put that pool site squarely on Callaway land. The next morning I drove to the Payne County Clerk's office. I'd walked those halls 1,000 times during my years as agricultural inspector. The clerks knew me by name. I asked to see the original subdivision plat for Timber Ridge Estates, filed in 2021 by Trent Development Group. What I found made me sit down. The plat on file matched the one Shelby had shown me. The boundary shifted 200 feet east. But when I pulled my deed and overlaid the legal descriptions, the conflict was obvious. Somebody had drawn the Timber Ridge boundary right through my pasture. Here's what most people don't know. In Oklahoma, when a subdivision plat conflicts with a recorded deed, the deed controls. It's called the Title Examination Standards, and it's not ambiguous. The deed is the senior document. The plat is junior. And my deed was recorded in 1958, 63 years before Brent Trent filed his plat. I made copies of everything. I took photographs of every page, and I drove home without saying a word to anyone. 2 days later, Shelby's lawyer sent me a cease and desist letter. It demanded that I remove all livestock from the HOA common area within 72 hours or face daily fines of $500. The letter cited the subdivision plat as authority. I read it twice, folded it neatly, and put it in the cabinet next to my deed. Then I went outside and fed my goats. The complaints started the following week, 4 of them, all filed with Payne County Code Enforcement within 72 hours of each other, all bearing the signature of Shelby Trent as HOA president. The first was a noise complaint, excessive animal vocalizations disrupting residential tranquility. That's how she described 50 goats eating breakfast. The second was an odor complaint, persistent livestock stench creating hostile living conditions for 42 families. The third was an environmental complaint, claiming my goat manure was contaminating the groundwater beneath Timber Ridge Estates. The fourth was a zoning challenge, alleging that my operation constituted unlicensed commercial agriculture within a residential impact zone. She filed them on a Monday. By Wednesday, a code enforcement inspector named Chet Farley was standing in my goat pen with a clipboard, a tape measure, and the tired expression of a man who already knew what he was going to find. I knew Chet. We'd worked in the same county building for 11 years before I retired. He was thorough, honest, and deeply annoyed by people who weaponized the complaint system. He measured the distance from my goat shelters to the nearest residential lot line. He inspected the waste management setup, the composting bins Jolene had designed, the drainage channels I'd graded myself, the gravel pads under the feeding stations. He checked the water runoff path. He tested the soil pH at 2 points along the fence line. Every measurement passed, every standard met. Not close, not borderline, clean. Chet closed his clipboard and looked at me. Wade, your operation is one of the best maintained small livestock setups in the county. You know that. I do. He lowered his voice. Between you and me, someone's burning my time on purpose. 4 complaints in 3 days, all from the same address, all for an operation that's been running clean for over a decade. He shook his head. I'll file my reports, all 4 dismissed. I thanked him. He drove away in his county truck, and I watched the dust settle on the gravel. A goat named Biscuit, the biggest doe in the herd, 190 pounds of stubborn boar muscle, walked over and leaned her head against my hip, the way she always did when she wanted attention or alfalfa pellets. I scratched behind her ears and looked at the pool construction across the field, where workers were now laying tile around the edge. 4 complaints, all dismissed. But Shelby wasn't done. 2 weeks later, I got a letter from the Payne County Planning Commission. It was a notice of review for my agricultural tax exemption. Under Oklahoma law, land actively used for agriculture qualifies for a tax exemption that can reduce your property tax burden by as much as 80%. Without it, my annual taxes would jump from $3,200 to nearly $26,000. On a retired inspector's pension and a small goat cheese operation, that kind of increase would break me in 2 years. The letter said the review had been requested by a member of the Planning Commission. It didn't name the member. It didn't have to. Brent Trent had sat on that commission for 4 years. I called Linnea Pruitt that afternoon. Linnea was a real estate attorney out of Stillwater who'd handled agricultural land disputes across 3 counties. She was sharp, patient, and had a voice that could make a judge sit up straighter. Wade, they can't pull your exemption, she said, and I could hear her flipping pages on the other end. Oklahoma Statute 68-2817 protects agricultural land that's actively in production. You've got 50 head of goats, an active dairy permit, and sales records going back 9 years. The Planning Commission doesn't have the authority to override a state-level exemption on producing farmland. Brent Trent thinks he does. Brent Trent is about to find out he doesn't. I'll file a formal objection tomorrow. And Wade, I want you to file a complaint under the Right to Farm Act, Section 2-18-1. It protects existing agricultural operations from nuisance actions brought by adjacent residential developments. That's exactly what this is. I hung up and sat on the porch for a long time. The sun was going down behind the Timber Ridge roof lines, turning the sky the color of ripe peaches. The pool construction site was lit up with work lights, and I could hear the hum of a generator and the scrape of trowels on concrete. My goats were settling in for the night. Soft sounds in the barn, hooves shuffling on straw, the low murmur of animals who trust the man who feeds them. Shelby Trent was trying to price me off my own land. She'd used complaints, environmental claims, and now her husband's seat on a government commission to squeeze a 3rd-generation rancher out of his home. She didn't know I'd spent 20 years enforcing the exact rules she was trying to twist. The pool was finished on the 2nd Saturday of October. $850,000 of concrete, Italian mosaic tile, LED underwater lighting, and a cedar cabana with a granite-top wet bar and ceiling fans that spun slow in the autumn breeze. Shelby threw a preview party for 40 residents, catered appetizers, a bartender mixing mojitos, and a 3-piece jazz combo playing under a white tent on the pool deck. I watched it from my porch through binoculars, not because I cared about the party, because I wanted to see what they'd done with the drainage. It didn't take long to find the answer. The pool's backwash system, the pipe that flushes chemically treated water during filter cleaning cycles, ran out of the pump house, across 20 feet of graded ground, and dumped straight into Blackberry Creek. No filter, no retention pond, no treatment basin, just a 4-inch PVC pipe pouring chlorinated water directly into a live stream that fed into the Cimarron River watershed. I noticed it because my goats noticed it first. For 3 days after the pool filled, the herd refused to drink from the section of Blackberry Creek that ran through my lower pasture. Goats are stubborn about a lot of things, but they're smart about water. If the water smells wrong, they won't touch it. And these animals were walking an extra quarter-mile uphill to drink from the stock tank near the barn, instead of using the creek they'd used their whole lives. That told me everything I needed to know. I drove to the farm supply store in Cushing, bought a water testing kit, and took 3 samples from the creek at 50-foot intervals below the pool discharge pipe. The chlorine levels came back at 14 times the Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality's limit for surface water discharge. 14 times. The pool backwash was turning Blackberry Creek into a chemical drain. I sealed the samples in sterile containers, photographed the discharge pipe from 3 angles, and filed a formal complaint with the Oklahoma DEQ that same afternoon. Then I put the test results in the cabinet with my deed, the plat copies, the dismissed code enforcement complaints, and the cease and desist letter. The folder was getting thick. But Shelby wasn't waiting for government agencies. The following Thursday, I drove out to check the goats and found a 6-foot chain-link fence running the entire perimeter of the pool complex. 40 posts, razor wire along the top rail, 3 padlocked gates with signs that read, Timber Ridge Country Club, residents only. No trespassing. Every inch of it was on my land. The fence cut off the traditional path my goats had used for years to reach the south section of the creek. The same creek they were already avoiding because Shelby's pool was poisoning it. My animals were now boxed into a smaller and smaller piece of their own pasture, stressed, losing weight, and separated from water sources they'd relied on for decades. I called Shelby. She answered on the 3rd ring with the cheerful tone of someone who thinks they've already won. The fence stays, Mr. Calloway. It's a safety barrier for our pool facility. If your animals damage it, you'll be billed for repairs. You built a fence on my property, Shelby. The plat says otherwise. Have your lawyer call our lawyer. We're done talking. Noted. I hung up. I drove back to the house, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened a fresh notebook. The same kind of notebook I'd used for 20 years of field inspections. Black cover, college ruled, 70 pages. I started writing. At the top of the first page I wrote, Violations, Timber Ridge Estates / Trent. Below it, I listed everything. Pool construction without a county building permit. Construction on land belonging to a third party. Discharge of chemically treated water into a protected waterway. Erection of a permanent fence structure on private agricultural land without owner consent. Filing of false nuisance complaints against an existing agricultural operation. Attempted interference with a state-level agricultural tax exemption through improper use of a planning commission seat. 6 violations, each one documented, each one photographed, each one supported by county records, water test results, or written correspondence. I closed the notebook and set my pen down next to a framed photograph of Jolene standing in the goat pen with Biscuit leaning against her leg. She was laughing in the picture, her hair blowing sideways in the Oklahoma wind, a bucket of feed in one hand and a soap mold in the other. They're pushing hard, Joe, I said to the photograph, but they don't know what they're pushing against. The next morning, I called a certified land surveyor named Darrell Evers. Darrell Evers had been surveying land in central Oklahoma for 31 years. He was the kind of man who measured twice, checked 3 times, and then measured again, because numbers don't lie, and people do. He showed up on a Tuesday morning in a mud-splattered truck with a GPS unit, a total station on a tripod, and a rolled bundle of iron rebar stakes in the bed. I walked the property with him. We started at the northeast corner pin my grandfather had set in 1958, a steel rod driven into limestone that hadn't moved in 65 years. From there, Darrell ran his lines south and west, shooting coordinates at every turn, driving fresh stakes at each corner, and calling out numbers to his assistant, who recorded them on a tablet. It took 4 hours. When he was done, he spread his field notes on the hood of his truck and laid my 1958 deed beside them. Wade. He tapped the map with a thick finger. Your western boundary sits exactly where your deed says it does, 200 feet west of where the Timber Ridge plat puts it. He traced the line with his finger. Every square inch of that pool, the deck, the cabana, the pump house, the fence, is on your property. Not close to the line, not straddling it, fully inside your parcel by 160 feet at the nearest point. I'd expected it. But hearing it confirmed by a licensed surveyor with GPS coordinates and iron pins in the ground made it real in a way that reading deeds in a county office never could. Now here's the interesting part, Daryl said. He pulled up the original subdivision plat that Brent Trent had filed with the county in 2021 and compared it with the version Shelby had given me. The plat on file at the clerk's office matches the one your HOA president showed you. But look at this. He opened a second file on his tablet, a digital copy of the plat as it appeared in the county's preliminary review records from 6 months before final approval. The preliminary version showed the Timber Ridge boundary exactly where it should have been, 200 feet west of where the approved version placed it. Somebody moved the line between preliminary review and final filing, Daryl said. The legal description was rewritten, the boundary coordinates were changed, and whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing, because they shifted the line just enough to capture your west pasture, without triggering the automated overlap alert in the county's GIS system. I stared at the two plats side by side. The preliminary one was correct. The filed one was fraudulent. Somewhere between review and recording, Brent Trent, or someone working for him, had altered a legal document to steal 2 acres of my family's land. In Oklahoma, falsifying a subdivision plat is not a civil matter. It falls under Title 21, Section 1561 of the Oklahoma statutes. Forgery of a public instrument. That's a felony. Up to 7 years in state prison. Brent hadn't just built a pool on my land. He'd committed a felony to make it look legal. I thanked Daryl and paid his invoice on the spot. He shook my hand and looked at me with the kind of expression a man wears when he knows he's just handed someone a loaded weapon. "What are you going to do with this, Wade?" "The right thing," I said, at the right time. That night I sat on the porch with Tucker Hayes, my neighbor to the north. Tucker had ranched the section above mine for 40 years. He'd watched Timber Ridge go up with the same quiet disgust that most old ranchers feel when good pasture gets turned into driveways and swimming pools. I showed him the surveys, both plats, the DEQ water samples, the dismissed code complaints, the cease and desist letter. Tucker listened without interrupting, the way men who work with cattle learn to listen. Patient, steady, waiting for the full picture before reacting. When I finished, he took a long pull from his beer and set the bottle on the porch rail. "They didn't just build on your land, Wade. They forged the paperwork to do it." "That's right." The crickets sang in the dark pasture. Somewhere down the hill, the LED lights of the pool glowed blue-green through the trees, casting shadows that moved with the water. "So what's next?" "I'm going to let them throw their grand opening party," I said, "and then I'm going to introduce them to my goats." The next 2 weeks were the busiest I'd had since my inspection days. I worked quietly, moved carefully, and told almost nobody what I was doing. The best traps are the ones the target walks into smiling. First, I met with Linnea Pruitt at her office on Main Street in Stillwater. Her desk was covered in land files and coffee rings, and she had reading glasses pushed up into hair the color of October wheat. I laid out everything: the deed, Daryl's survey, both versions of the plat, the DEQ water results, the fence, the complaints, the tax exemption threat. She studied the documents for 20 minutes without speaking. Then she took off her glasses and looked at me. "Wade, you have a 3-pronged case. First, trespass and encroachment. They built an $850,000 structure on your property without permission. Second, the plat fraud. Someone altered a filed subdivision document between preliminary review and final recording. That's a felony. Third, the DEQ violation. Chlorinated backwash discharged into a protected waterway without a permit. What do we file first?" Quiet title action, Section 12-1141 of the Oklahoma statutes. It's a court proceeding that establishes definitive ownership when there's a boundary dispute. Once the judge rules the land is yours, and he will, because the deed and the survey are bulletproof, everything built on it becomes your property, or has to be removed at their expense. Most people don't know about quiet title actions. They think property disputes are settled by arguing with your neighbor or calling the sheriff. But in every state in the country, there's a legal process specifically designed to settle who owns what, once and for all. In Oklahoma, it takes about 60 days from filing to ruling, and the burden of proof falls on whoever's challenging the existing deed. Brent Trent would have to prove his fraudulent plat was more valid than a deed recorded in 1958. Good luck. Linnea filed the quiet title action the next day. She also forwarded the survey and plat comparison to the Payne County District Attorney's Office, with a formal request to investigate the plat alteration as forgery. While the legal machinery turned, I built my gate. I chose a spot on the old fence line where the west pasture connected to the 2 acres the pool sat on. The ground there was flat, the soil was packed clay, and there was a natural slope that ran downhill from the goat shelters to the pool deck, a path any grazing animal would follow instinctively if given the chance. I set 2 steel posts in concrete, hung a 5-foot galvanized gate on heavy-duty hinges, and installed a drop latch that I could open with one hand. The gate swung outward, toward the pool. I oiled the hinges until they moved without a sound. Then I prepared the path. Over 3 nights, I scattered a thin trail of alfalfa pellets from the goat pen, through the gate opening, and down the slope toward the pool. Not enough to see from a distance, just enough to establish a scent trail the goats would remember and follow. Boer goats are creatures of habit. Show them a path with food on it twice, and they'll walk it on their own the 3rd time. I called Tucker and told him what I needed. Within a week, he'd reached out to 6 other ranchers and landowners along the Timber Ridge perimeter, men and women who'd each had their own run-ins with Shelby's complaints, Brent's zoning games, or the HOA's habit of treating neighboring properties like extensions of their HOA kingdom. Every one of them agreed to attend the grand opening pool party as witnesses. Last, I called Russ Whitman at the Stillwater News Press. Russ had covered county land disputes for 15 years. He was fair, thorough, and had a nose for stories that involved public officials behaving badly. Russ, the Timber Ridge HOA is throwing a grand opening for their new pool next Saturday. County Commissioner's cutting the ribbon. You might want to bring a camera.
Why's that, Wade?
Because the pool's sitting on my cattle field, and I've got the deed, the survey, and a herd of 50 goats who haven't had a proper drink in weeks. Russ was quiet for 3 seconds. I'll be there at 10. I hung up and walked out to the gate. The hinges were silent. The alfalfa trail was invisible in the grass. The goats were grazing nearby, Biscuit at the front of the herd as always, her head up, ears forward, watching me with the calm curiosity of an animal who knows something is about to change.
Saturday, girls, I said. Saturday.
Shelby found out about the quiet title action on a Wednesday. Her lawyer must have called her within an hour of receiving the filing, because by noon, she was standing at the end of my driveway in her Escalade with the window down, screaming at me across the cattle guard.
You're suing us? Over a piece of scrub pasture? You have any idea how much money this community has invested in that pool?
I was replacing a fence post near the road and didn't look up. $850,000, from what I hear.
And you think a judge is going to tear it out because of a line on some 60-year-old piece of paper? I think a judge is going to read my deed, look at the survey, and do what the law requires.
She sat there for a moment, engine idling, knuckles white on the steering wheel. I could smell her perfume from 30 feet away, something floral and sharp that cut through the smell of cedar shavings and post-hole dirt.
This isn't over, Calloway.
I know it isn't. She backed up, swung the Escalade around hard enough to throw gravel into my fence line, and disappeared toward Timber Ridge. The dust hung in the air for a full minute after she left.
3 days later, the HOA's attorney filed a motion for an emergency injunction.
The request asked the court to prohibit me from interfering with, accessing, or disrupting the Timber Ridge Community Pool facility until the quiet title action was resolved. The argument was that the pool represented a significant community investment, and that any disruption would cause irreparable financial and emotional harm to 42 families. Judge Warren Hadley heard the motion on a Friday morning. Linnea and I sat on one side of the courtroom. The HOA's attorney, a tall man from an Oklahoma City firm with a silk tie and polished shoes, sat on the other. The judge read the deed. He read the survey. He read the plat. He looked at the HOA's attorney over the top of his reading glasses. Counsel, your client built an $850,000 swimming pool on another man's cattle field without a building permit, without a property survey, and without, as far as I can tell, bothering to check who owned the land first. He closed the folder. I'm not inclined to issue an injunction protecting an unlicensed structure on someone else's property. Motion denied. Linnea squeezed my arm once under the table. We walked out of the courthouse into sunlight that smelled like cut grass and Oklahoma autumn. The denial lit a fire under Shelby. She went door to door in Timber Ridge with a petition titled, "Protect Our Pool from Agricultural Encroachment." She told residents that a stubborn farmer was trying to shut down the community's amenities out of spite. She cried at one doorstep. She brought homemade cookies to another. In 4 days, she had 80 signatures from people who had no idea the pool was built on stolen land. Then Brent made his move. He called me on a Tuesday evening while I was cleaning the cheese press in the dairy barn. His voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man who solves problems with checkbooks. "Wade, let's be practical. I'll write you a check for $200,000. Right now. You sign a quitclaim deed transferring those 2 acres. The pool stays where it is. Everybody's happy." "That land's been in my family since 1958, Brent. My wife raised goats on it. My grandfather ran cattle on it. It's not for sale." "$250 then. Final offer. Good night, Brent." I hung up. What Brent didn't know, what Shelby didn't know either, was that Oklahoma is a one-party consent state for phone recordings. I'd been recording since the moment I answered. His offer to buy land he'd already fraudulently claimed on a public document would sit very nicely next to the plat comparison in the DA's file. 2 days before the grand opening, Shelby made one last attempt. She called Chet Farley at Code Enforcement and reported my goat barn as an unsafe agricultural structure, posing imminent danger to adjacent residents. Chet drove out. I met him at the barn door. He walked through, tapped the rafters, checked the ventilation, and inspected the foundation. Biscuit wandered over and licked his hand. Chet laughed. "Wade, this barn is in better shape than my garage." He closed his clipboard. "Passing marks on everything. Again." "Thanks, Chet." He paused at his truck. "Saturday's the pool party, isn't it?" "So I hear." He gave me a look. Not a question exactly, but the expression of a man who can see the shape of something coming and knows enough to stay out of the way. The week before the grand opening, Shelby went personal. She posted in the Timber Ridge Estates private Facebook group, a closed group with 312 members that included residents, their families, and a few local realtors. The post was long, emotional, and carefully designed to make me look like the villain. "Our community has invested nearly $1 million in a beautiful pool facility for our families. One local farmer is trying to destroy that investment because he refuses to accept the legal boundaries of our development. He has filed a frivolous lawsuit. He has refused reasonable offers to resolve the dispute, and he continues to operate a smelly, noisy goat farm directly adjacent to our children's play areas." She tagged it with a photo of my goat pen taken from the Timber Ridge side, framed to make the operation look as rundown and unpleasant as possible. She ended with, "We will protect our community, we will protect our pool, and we will not be bullied by one stubborn man who refuses to move with the times." 47 likes, 22 comments, most of them from residents who'd never walked 10 feet past their own mailbox, but had plenty of opinions about farmers and property rights. One comment called me the goat man who smells like his barn. Another suggested the HOA should buy him out and shut the whole operation down. A woman I'd never met wrote that she was genuinely afraid of the animals on the other side of the fence. Tucker showed me the screenshots. He had a niece who lived in Timber Ridge and sent them over without Shelby knowing. I read them on the porch, set the phone down, and didn't say a word. "You okay?" Tucker asked. "Jolene dealt with worse," I said. "People called her the crazy goat lady for years before they started buying her soap at $12 a bar." The next morning, things got physical. I found fast food wrappers, empty beer cans, and 3 garbage bags thrown over my fence along the Timber Ridge boundary. Someone had driven along the road at night and tossed their trash onto my pasture. One of the bags had broken open near the water trough. A goat named Penny had eaten part of a plastic wrapper and was standing by the barn looking bloated and miserable. I spent 2 hours with my arm down her throat, pulling plastic out of her gut while she cried. That was the moment I stopped feeling conflicted about what was coming. 4 days before the party, Linnea called with the news I'd been waiting for. "The judge ruled, Wade. Quiet title granted. The 2 acres are confirmed as Callaway property. Continuous ownership since 1958. The pool, the cabana, the fence, the pump house. All of it is classified as unauthorized encroachment on private agricultural land." I sat down on the porch step and let out a breath I'd been holding for 2 months. "There's more," she said. Judge Hadley included a note in his order, recommending the district attorney investigate the plat discrepancy as a potential forgery case. And the DA's office called me this morning. They've opened a formal investigation into Brent Trent for falsifying a public recording instrument. What about the DEQ? Notice of violation issued yesterday. Unauthorized discharge of chemically treated water into Blackberry Creek. Fine pending, estimated between $75,000 and $100,000. Everything was converging. The legal system, the environmental regulators, and the criminal justice apparatus were all moving toward the same target at the same time. All I had to do was pick the moment. Friday night. The night before the grand opening. I sat on the porch with a glass of sweet tea and watched the workers set up for the party. White tents going up over the pool deck. Strings of Edison bulbs hanging between cedar posts. A bouncy castle inflating in the corner of what used to be my goat run. Catering trucks backing down the gravel drive. A banner stretching across the cabana that read, "Welcome to Timber Ridge Country Club," in gold letters on navy blue. They were building a celebration on stolen land. And tomorrow, the land was going to remind them who it belonged to. I walked out to the barn and checked the goats one last time. They were bedded down in clean straw, bellies full, water fresh. Biscuit stood by the gate as always, her big brown eyes catching the barn light. "Tomorrow morning, Biscuit, there's a pool down the hill full of clean water, and nobody's going to stop you from drinking it." She blinked once and went back to chewing. I oiled the gate hinges one more time, then I went to bed. Saturday morning came in warm and gold, the kind of Oklahoma October day that makes you forget winter exists. I was up at 5, feeding the goats in the barn while the sky turned from gray to pink to pale blue. By 7, I could hear the catering crew arriving at the pool, truck doors slamming, the clatter of chafing dishes, someone testing a sound system with a boom that rolled across the pasture and spooked 2 of my younger does. By 9:30, the party was taking shape. I watched from the rise near my barn as 200 people filed through the Timber Ridge gate and walked down the path to the pool deck. Families with kids in swimsuits, couples in linen and sunglasses, a DJ setting up under the cabana with speakers the size of hay bales, 3 grills smoking with brisket and chicken, a table of desserts covered in plastic wrap, a bouncy castle where children were already screaming and bouncing. And at the center of it all, Shelby Trent in a white sundress with gold sandals, a wireless microphone in one hand and a champagne flute in the other. County Commissioner Glenn Hargrove stood near the pool's edge in a gray suit, waiting to cut a red ribbon stretched between 2 potted palms. Russ Whitman stood 15 feet away with a cameraman, notebook open, pen ready. Sheriff Colton Nash was there too, not for the party. I'd called his office Thursday afternoon and asked him to be present, not to arrest anyone, not to serve papers, just to be there in case things got loud. He'd agreed without asking too many questions. He was parked at the edge of the lot in his department SUV, arms crossed, watching. Tucker Hayes and 6 ranchers stood at the back of the crowd in boots and work jeans, looking about as comfortable as cattle at a car wash. At 11 o'clock sharp, Shelby tapped the microphone. "Welcome, everyone, to the grand opening of the Timber Ridge Country Club pool. This pool represents everything our community stands for: investment, beauty, and a commitment to the quality of life that brought all of us to." I opened the gate. The hinges didn't make a sound. The gate swung wide into the morning air, and the alfalfa trail caught the breeze and carried its scent down the slope. Biscuit was the first one through. She trotted down the hill with her head up and her ears forward, 190 pounds of boar determination, heading straight for the water. Behind her came the rest of the herd, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 goats pouring through the gate like a woolly river, hooves drumming on the packed clay, bells jingling, voices rising in the collective bleat of animals who found something interesting and want everyone to know about it. Biscuit reached the pool deck first. She walked across the Italian tile, sniffed a chaise lounge, knocked over a tray of canapes, and jumped into the shallow end with a splash that sent water across 3 feet of pool deck and onto the shoes of Commissioner Hargrove. The crowd went silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then it went loud. Goats were everywhere. In the pool, on the lounge chairs, under the dessert table. One climbed onto the DJ booth and knocked a speaker sideways. Another ate the corner of the welcome banner. 3 does waded into the deep end and stood chest-deep in chlorinated water, drinking with the calm satisfaction of animals who'd been thirsty for weeks. A kid, a 4-month-old buckling named Copper, jumped onto the bouncy castle and bounced once, which made every child at the party scream with delight and every adult freeze in horror. Shelby dropped her microphone. "Somebody stop those animals!" Nobody moved, because nobody knew what to do. You can't herd 50 goats out of a swimming pool with cocktail napkins and good intentions. I walked through the gate, down the slope, and onto the pool deck. I was wearing my work boots, my feed store cap, and I was carrying a manila folder. I walked past the goats, past the overturned appetizer table, past the DJ who'd given up and was filming on his phone. I stopped in front of Commissioner Hargrove and handed him the folder. Commissioner, this pool sits on 160 feet of my cattle pasture. Here's my deed, recorded 1958. Here's a certified survey completed 3 weeks ago. Here's a quiet title judgment entered by Judge Hadley on Tuesday, confirming my ownership. And here's a notice of violation from the Oklahoma DEQ for illegal discharge of chlorinated water into Blackberry Creek. Hargrove opened the folder, read the first page, looked at me, looked at Shelby, looked at the goats drinking from his pool. Sheriff Nash walked over. He'd read the quiet title order already. She's on his land, Commissioner. The court confirmed it. Shelby turned to Brent. Brent was staring at the ground like it might open up and swallow him. I looked at the camera. At Russ Whitman scribbling so fast his pen was a blur. At 200 residents who'd just learned their country club pool was built on a stolen cattle field. Ma'am, I said, your country club pool is my goat's drinking pond now. And they say the water's fine. The Stillwater News Press ran the story on Sunday. Front page, above the fold. The headline read, HO, a pool built on rancher's land. Goats crash grand opening. Russ Whitman's article included the quiet title ruling, the DEQ violation, and a photograph of Biscuit standing chest deep in the shallow end that went viral on social media within 48 hours. 3 Oklahoma City television stations picked it up by Monday. A Dallas morning show ran a segment on Tuesday. By Wednesday, the phrase goat pool party had its own hashtag, and the Callaway goat herd had more followers than Timber Ridge Estates. The legal consequences were swift and final. The court ordered the HOA to demolish the pool, the cabana, the pump house, and the fence at their own expense. The demolition cost $340,000, almost half of what they'd spent building it. 42 families who'd been assessed a special pool amenity fee of $6,200 each were entitled to full refunds. The HOA's reserve fund, which Shelby had managed for 7 years, was wiped out. Brent Trent was indicted by a Payne County grand jury on 1 count of forgery of a public recording instrument, a felony under Oklahoma law carrying a maximum sentence of 7 years. His attorney negotiated a plea to a lesser charge, but the conviction cost him his seat on the Planning Commission, his real estate license, and what was left of his reputation. Shelby resigned as HOA president 3 days after the indictment. The vote was 38-4. She sold the house 6 weeks later and moved to a condo in Edmond. The Escalade was traded in for a sedan. The clipboard went wherever clipboards go when the person holding them no longer has anything to inspect. The Oklahoma DEQ fined the HOA $85,000 for the unauthorized discharge into Blackberry Creek. A remediation crew spent 2 weeks testing and treating the creek downstream from the pool site. The chlorine levels returned to normal within a month. My goats started drinking from the creek again by Thanksgiving. Cole moved home permanently in November. He took over the soap and cheese operation, redesigned the labels, built a website, and started shipping Jolene's products across 4 states. The little drawing of the goat on the fence post stayed on every label. It was his mother's design, and some things you don't change. I used the settlement money to do something Jolene and I had talked about for years, but never had the resources to build. On the 2 acres where the pool had been, I constructed a permanent community farmers market. A covered pavilion with running water, electrical hookups, and 14 vendor stalls. It opened the first Saturday of April, with local ranchers selling beef and eggs, beekeepers selling honey, and Cole running a booth with fresh chev and bars of Jolene's goat milk soap wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. We called it the Jolene Callaway Community Market. 14 vendors set up every Saturday. Families from Timber Ridge started coming, then families from Stillwater, then people from as far away as Tulsa and Ponca City. A retired schoolteacher from Cushing started a junior rancher program at the market, teaching kids how to feed goats, check soil, and understand where food comes from before it reaches a grocery shelf. 6 Timber Ridge families became regular customers. One of them, a young couple with 2 kids who'd signed Shelby's petition without knowing the full story, started buying a wheel of chèvre every week. The wife told Cole she'd never known goat cheese could taste like that. Cole told her it was his mother's recipe. I stood at the market on a Saturday morning in May, watching kids chase goats across the pasture while their parents browsed vendor stalls. The sun was warm, the grass was green. Biscuit was asleep under the pavilion, stretched out on cool concrete like she owned the place. She kind of did. If you've ever had someone build on your land, ignore your deed, and then tell you to move your animals, I want to hear about it. Drop your story in the comments, because every piece of land has a history, and every history deserves to be respected. And if you like this story, hit subscribe. We post new stories every week. Next time, the HOA president who paved over a veteran's memorial walkway. The veteran was a retired federal judge, and he had a very long memory. You don't want to miss that one.
Folks, let me tell you what made Shelby Trans lose everything. It wasn't the goats. It wasn't the pool party. It was the assumption that power means you don't have to check the paperwork. She spent 7 years running that HOA like a personal kingdom. She filed complaints she knew were baseless. She built fences on land she didn't own. She let her husband forge a government document to steal 2 acres from a family that had been there for 60 years before her subdivision broke ground. And she did all of it because she believed nobody would ever push back. Would Calloway push back? Not with anger, not with threats, with a deed, a surveyor, a water test kit, and the patience of a man who spent 20 years enforcing the rules for a living. Every document he filed was correct. Every step he took was legal, and every day he waited was another day Shelby dug herself deeper. The lesson here is simple. Know your land, know your rights, and when someone tells you the boundaries have changed, go to the clerk's office and check the records yourself. Because a deed recorded in 1958 beats a forged plat filed every single day. Every single time. If you ever dealt with an HOA that treated your property like your playground, drop your story in the comments. We'll read everyone. And if this is your first time here, hit the subscribe button. We've got a new story every week, and next time it involves an HOA president who paved over a veteran's memorial walkway. The veteran was a retired federal judge. You already know how that ends.